a couple of quick disclaimers before we begin. So I'll be ranking each of these NHL games on a relative scale. So I think in absolute terms, each NHL game has been at least a little bit better than the one before it. There's a couple of exceptions. Also important to note that we'll only be considering the gameplay, so not the other features in the game. And also I'll probably have some bias towards the competitive side of things, because that's mainly what I've been playing. Starting off with NHL 25, we'll work our way backwards through the years. So the newest NHL game, and this game from a 1v1 competitive point of view, is the worst by far. Nothing comes close to it. The worst game ever, if we were only talking about 1v1 competitively. But on the other hand, I've also played the 6v6 side of things, and honestly, out of the games where I've played sixes, so everything from 21 to 25, it might be the best game. So I'll give at least some credit for what the game is on the World of Chell side of things, but I've always been more of a 1v1 player, and this is the first year where I stopped playing 1v1. Like, normally I would even play during the summer, but this year I stopped playing 1v1. I quit HOT in December. I just could not play it. It does have to be said that a big part of it is probably also that there wasn't any GWC or tournaments like that. But overall, I think the gameplay is bad, even from more of a casual point of view. And then if you look at the pure competitive side of things, if you look at tournaments, the gameplay is absolutely horrendous. So ranking NHL 25 on a scale from 1 to 10, if we were only talking 1v1 competitive, it would be a 1 or even less if I could. But just because of the sixes side, and I don't think it's the worst game ever in terms of like more casual, so I'll give it a 3 out of 10. And then also here you can see the whole ranking of these games. Also, we'll only rank the games from 17 to 25. At the end, I will talk about games from 07 to 16, but just because I never played those games online, I think it's a little bit unfair to include them on this list. I just can't really compare my NHL 13 experience with my NHL 25 experience, you know. Now moving on to NHL 24, and a huge thing when ranking this game depends on when you look at the game. So NHL 24, unlike most NHLs, got actually consistently patched throughout the year. So the gameplay at the start of NHL 24 with the full pressure system and everything, it was bad. It was bad, but honestly, after all the patches they did, it was kind of okay, in my opinion. I feel like a big part of the reason why I still didn't love this game is kind of the fact that every NHL since 22 has been a little bit like sluggish. It hasn't been as smooth as the gameplay was in like NHL 21 and the games before that. Part of the reason why it is a little bit more like sluggish is also that it's a little bit more realistic. And also 25, 24, and then NHL 23 was the first one where this was the problem. The goaltending. I really dislike the way the goalies move in the game. They're so much faster going side to side in certain situations. It just feels like they're making saves that they shouldn't be making, and then vice versa, letting in a lot of goals. Especially NHL 24, this was a big year where I felt like every single one-timer is getting saved, but at the same time, all the worst types of goals were going in. But as a whole, I think NHL 24 is actually very comparable to NHL 25, even on an absolute scale. So therefore, it must be higher on the relative list than NHL 25. Also, if we're comparing 24 and 25, just my personal experience is that 1v1 in 24 was better, but 6v6 was worse quite considerably. But overall, on this relative scale, 24 does rank higher than 25, and I think I will give it a 4 out of 10 rating. Now moving on to NHL 23, and overall, this gameplay was actually really smooth compared to 22 or 24. So in my opinion, 22 was kind of the first year where EA really put in a lot of effort to make the game more realistic. But I feel like in NHL 23, they kinda bounced back from it and made it a little bit smoother. For example, the skating felt a lot smoother, the passing was a little bit smoother. And I think in absolute terms, I feel like 23, 24, and 25 are all like very, very close. If the games are equally good, that just means the older game was ahead of its time. But what ruins NHL 23 for me is that this was the first year they changed the goalies. Like, if you just took the goalies from NHL 22 and kept them the same, and everything else is the same as it was in NHL 23, I think that's a really great game. But the current goalies that we still have in NHL 25, I feel like they've been pretty much the same in 23 and 24 as well. That just kind of ruins NHL 23 for me. Also, one more point, just because I mainly look at the competitive side of things in 1v1. I feel like the newest games, so 23, 24, 25, maybe even like 22, 21, have a little bit of a disadvantage compared to the older games, just because there is a lot more knowledge. And I feel like everyone is learning all the glitch goals in the game and stuff like that. So I feel like at some point between like NHL 21 and 23, somewhere along those lines, we kind of hit a point where the players' mechanical skills kind of overtook what the game was like supposed to handle in a way. So that's why I feel like the new NHL games don't really work as intended, because the game has become a lot more about the mechanical side of things, not as much about, you know, simple things like passing and stuff like that. As I said, I will put NHL 23 above 24 and 25. I feel like NHL 23 was just this close to being a really amazing game, but just because of the goalies and some of the other things in the game as well, I feel like it could have been, you know, an 8 out of 10, a 9 out of 10, but just because of some of these issues, I'll have to give it like a 5.5 out of 10. Now moving on to NHL 22. This is the most realistic NHL game we have ever had. At least when it comes to how the game was actually being played. It was much more defensive. It was a lot more about your hockey sense. And for example, this is the year where they changed the passing to be a lot more realistic than it was in the past. You couldn't just freely pass backhand passes behind your back like you used to be able to do in old NHL games. Now the thing is that realism doesn't always equal good, but that's just so much about what do I want to weigh when it comes to this ranking, you know? So 22, I'll say it again, it was the most realistic game we've ever had. Also, I feel like the goalies were a big reason why NHL 22 was so good. The way the goal scoring worked was a lot more realistic. I feel like that is a huge plus when it comes to this game. Also, I feel like the gameplay really rewarded good defensive plays, which I also really like. I can say it already, this is going at the top of the list above 23, 24, 25 very easily. But when we're talking about the realism of NHL 22, it did come at a cost for sure. It's just not as smooth, not as enjoyable, not as fun to watch as the other games necessarily. So that does bring my rating down just a little bit. So therefore, I will give it a 7 out of 10 rating. Moving on to NHL 21. And this is probably the biggest contrast we've ever had between gameplay from one NHL to the next. 21 and 22, completely opposite things that were good about these games. And this is really where this list gets interesting, because it's just so much about what do you want to weigh when it comes to this. If NHL 22 was, in my opinion, the most realistic game we've ever had, NHL 21 has the biggest skill gap out of any NHL game, and it's not really even close. But this is not to say that there was a lot of negatives with NHL 21. So if NHL 22's goal scoring was realistic and you were rewarded for good defense, NHL 21 is the complete opposite. There were so many glitch goals, defending was pretty impossible, like you could not intercept passes almost at all. There were so many glitch goals, it's almost unbelievable. But on the other hand, pretty much all of those goals required some mechanical skill. I think NHL 21 was the most demanding game mechanically if we're talking about how it was played competitively, which I think is a positive thing. Also, as mentioned before, NHL 22 took that leap to be a lot more realistic, which was in some ways a negative thing. So NHL 21 was really the last game where you could make ridiculous passes. Saucer passes were also insanely effective if you knew how to do them. And that's another one of those things that added to the skill gap of this game. Oh man, it is so difficult for me to rank this one because I know there's so many people in the competitive scene that would say like NHL 21 was the best game ever. But then on the other hand, there was so many huge issues with the gameplay. For me personally, I can appreciate all the good things about NHL 21, but I cannot forget about some of the biggest issues. So therefore, I'll give it a 6.5. We'll give it a 6.5 out of 10. So just right there behind NHL 22. I think that's a pretty fair place for this game to be. It's very difficult though, because this was probably the most fun NHL in some ways for me. But in other moments, I remember this being maybe the most frustrating game ever. It's very hard to rank. I'll put it right there at the second spot for now though. Now moving on to NHL 20. So honestly, I remember NHL 20 being a very smooth game overall. I don't remember what were like the huge issues of NHL 20. Backskating was insane, just like it was in 21 as well and 19. But what do I really even remember from NHL 20? I think D2Ds were pretty strong in NHL 20. I remember the one-hander being the go-to breakaway move, which was kind of dumb. But like honestly, I feel like NHL 20 was a really good game. Like honestly, what's wrong with NHL 20? Bro, I just went to look at some GWC highlights from NHL 20. I don't see much wrong with that game. Yeah, obviously it was really one-timer heavy, and also I saw a lot of one-handers, but those sort of things are always in the game. There's always some kind of a go-to way to score, and I think overall in NHL 20, I would rather have that gameplay than any other. So for me, relatively speaking, once again, I don't think NHL 20 is better on an absolute scale than the new NHLs, but on a relative scale, I think NHL 20 is the best. I'm gonna say it right now. I think on a relative scale, NHL 20, best game ever. Also, this is just because NHL 13 and 14 aren't on the list. If they were on the list, those could be candidates for the best relative game ever. But out of the ones I've played, NHL 20, number one. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Now moving on to NHL 19. Honestly, I need a little bit of a reminder. I'm gonna go look at some YouTube videos about the game. I feel like this is pretty close to NHL 20 gameplay. I believe this was the first year where the backskating became like insane. But I feel like NHL 19, like just the way the game functions, the animations and everything like that, they weren't quite as smooth as they were in 20 and 21. But yeah, it's still kind of similar to what NHL 20 is, but I do think 20 overall was a lot more of a complete game than 19. I'll give NHL 19 a 7, and I'll rank it right there after NHL 22, just because I feel like NHL 19 didn't quite yet have the balance that was added in NHL 20. Now moving on to NHL 18, and I gotta be honest with you, 18 and 19, for some reason, I always kind of grouped them together in my head, and I feel like the games were pretty similar for the most part. And I do know that the skating engine was updated for NHL 19, but I think in some ways also the simplicity of what we had before then was kind of nice, you know? And if you want to talk about the improvements that NHL 19 made compared to 18, I feel like they're pretty much in line with what you would expect on a year-to-year basis. I'll give NHL 18 like a 6 out of 10. So it's right there, just behind NHL 21 and 19. I think that's a pretty fair place to have it. And now NHL 17, the first NHL game I played online. And I might be very biased when it comes to NHL 17. I think NHL 17 was really good. Obviously the game was a lot slower, it worked a lot differently than the newer games, but for its time, I think 17 was a really awesome game. The problem I have with games before 20 is that I was just so young back then when I played them that I can't really compare how these actually compare to each other and how they compare to the new games, just because I just thought of the game so much differently back then, and honestly, I don't really have any reasons why NHL 17 was so good for me. It's really hard to explain when I don't really have anything to say about the game. I just remember how I felt playing the game, and obviously probably very biased because this was the first NHL where I started playing HOT. So for me, NHL 17 gets an 8 out of 10 rating, and that's gonna put it at number 2 on this list. And now, looking at the list, I'm pretty happy with it. Now at the end of this video, I'll also talk about the golden era of NHL, which I think is starting from around NHL 11 and then through 12, 13, 14. You can kind of make a case for NHL 15 as well, because I feel like the gameplay of NHL 15 was pretty good. But if you remember, NHL 14, the last game that was fully released on the PS3 and the Xbox 360 era, all the features and stuff that that game had was way ahead of its time. NHL 13 was also really good in that regard. But yeah, if we're talking in relative terms, I think NHL 13 and 14 are the two games that were, relatively speaking, the best ever. I remember I played NHL 11 a lot as well, so maybe biased, but I feel like that was, for its time, a really good game. 10 and 12 were pretty similar to what 11 was as well. And then if we go back to older NHLs, 09, 08, I think I've played those. Maybe 07. I haven't played anything before that, but I feel like around that time the conversation just completely shifts, because games were so like bare bones around that time that it doesn't really even make sense comparing something like NHL, you know, 2006 to NHL 25. It's just a completely different era, and I haven't played those games. And then if you want to talk about like NHL 94, it's just a completely dumb comparison, comparing NHL 25 to NHL 94. It just doesn't even make sense at that point. The difference there is just way too big. But I did my best, and here's the ranking I came up with. Let me know in the comments what you think of it. Was I possibly biased towards something like NHL 17, which just happened to be my first NHL online? Or is this ranking pretty fair? Let me know. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Take care, and thanks for watching.